What's the name of the title? I wonder. What's the name of the title?
It's December.
What's the name of the title?
Ides of December. Hit go loud.
I know, but I wanted to name it. That's.
Ides of December.
Oh shoot! I need to turn that down. Sorry. Hey, Leonard. Kathy, yay.
That was so good. I was thinking about
What?
4 minutes, 30 seconds.
This is interesting.
Because then it does this.
Hey, you!
What is that?
Me! Yeah,
I'll
you!
just cut that out.
Don't you want to play something different?
Okay, hey
Get
guys.
off!
There we go. We were going to show a bit more of that movie, but the little opening stuff, the titles and stuff, kind of gets you into the mode of what we're going to talk about today. So we're back with Ides a week late because of my schedule, but here we are.
Making the Ides great again. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Fighting Bunch.
I got it. Here you go. Great book that Yvonne and I both just got through reading, The Fighting Bunch, The Battle of Athens. And it's about the only successful armed rebellion since the Revolution in the United States. And a lot of people don't know about this, including a lot of people from Athens, Tennessee. So I think we got, a constant refrain with all of our Ides episodes is nothing new under the sun. And we've talked about apocalypse. We've talked about the CDC and the Epidemic Intelligence Service. We've talked about the FBI and the players there, current and past. And we've talked about the Dreyfus affair in France that took place around, before, a little
90s.
after the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s.
I'm getting that confused with
We've revisited Watergate. We've talked about Dutroux, which was a serial pedophile in Belgium who was leagues ahead of what Epstein was just accused of, much less what he got.
But it's kind of the same thing. Our government covered up. Their government covered up for him the way our government covered up for Epstein.
So we're going to talk about the Battle of Athens tonight and how, and again, nothing new under the sun. Everything that we go through it's been happening. It's a constant story throughout time, and all the things that we go through and the struggles that we have here on this fallen world.
Right.
So Yvonne's got some detailed stuff to go into on this, and I'm going to also kind of every once in a while just kind of get into how it's been covered and how they changed things. We talked about Edgar Allan Poe last month, how they changed. They wrote his story after he died. His enemies did.
His enemies wrote his story, and
turned
that
him
image of who he was, this drunkard, it's not who he was.
Try to turn him into something he wasn't. So one thing we find constantly in the past and re-looking at history is what are they saying about the people in the past and why? And if it's very negative,
Yeah.
you gotta ask questions
Question it.
about why. Why is this, Napoleonic complex, Napoleon short man? He really wasn't that short.
Right.
And, maybe he was this bad ogre, but why did they, try to take him down, shortly in the middle of the 19th century and going into the present, all the way till we have Napoleonic complex, which is a negative connotation. So,
and why do we not know? Why do we not know the story?
Why do we not know
about the Fighting Bunch? It happened in Athens, freaking Tennessee. It was pretty big. So who was the Fighting Bunch? Well, the Fighting Bunch were a group of men from Athens, Tennessee, or McMinnville, Tennessee.
McMinn County.
It's Eastern Tennessee. And actually, how many men from Tennessee went and fought?
Well, just in McMinn County alone, this happened in 1946, the Battle of Athens. It was the election of 46. And we're going to get into the details of who the players were, but a lot of veterans had come back from the war. And McMinn County alone had about 3,000 returning veterans. And they had gone to Japan or North Africa, D-Day and things like that, and fought in Europe. And they come back to face what they were fighting, supposedly.
Right, fascism.
Overseas and enduring terrible trials and buddies, friends getting killed.
The book does a really good job of going over their trials and tribulations when they in the war, and it's really interesting to see. I haven't really delved into just the personal stories of war. I don't like it, but the what he puts in this book, it really gives you a sense of these men that went off at 17, 18, one of them even 14.
Yeah, a Medal of Honor winner at 17.
And how they grew into men really quick.
But they come home, and there's about 3,000 of them in McMinn County alone,
right,
which was a good 10% of the population of that county. And so this little machine with these bosses, these county bosses, they were in control of this town before the war even started, but they escalated. I mean, because they were able to just pick on a bunch of women whose husbands and sons and brothers and stuff were off to war.
So somebody in the comments says that they live within 30 miles of Athens, Tennessee. That's interesting. Tyrants are the same everywhere. This is true. So we were going to start out with, what the Battle of Athens was, and I think it's great that we're talking about this now, because we have the election that, story that we're going through right now, which we don't know how it's going to end. Don't tell the media that they don't pick our presidents, but it's not decided and it's not over. But reading through this book, it's just like total deja vu, nothing new under the sun. We're going through the same things, and even that we're in the age of the internet and the digital world, but it's the same exact problems, just with different.
And now they use consent by a lot of the people instead of guns to get their way. People don't push back.
Oh, wow. So this person that lives 30 miles from, this is an important point. This person that lives 30 miles from Athens doesn't know anything about this fight.
Right.
That's one of the things that we've learned through reading the book, that there are people in Athens
that don't know this story. There are people who are school teachers there was a lady who was a reporter that interviewed one of these guys some years ago that took part in this, and she didn't know about this until she went to interview this guy.
Right.
And a lot of them, they didn't talk about it afterwards, but it did make national news the day of and in the week after. And so,
right.
And some of it, of course, was slanted and painted.
It's kind of amazing, though, because just in a nutshell, it's a story of election fraud, of corruption at the deepest levels of government. And these men, the Fighting Bunch, they took care of business. They took up arms, which I'm not suggesting that's where we are, because I don't think that's where we are.
And that's where it goes back to what I was saying, is that what's being used now is our consent is letting all this happen. So they don't need guns
so this
to
built
do
up.
this.
This built up even before they left for the war. This began in like 1936, you think?
36 or so is when he first was
and so they went off to war, and then they come back, and we're talking like 1945-ish into 1946.
Yeah.
So it grew into this, and because nobody took care of business, and then of course all your strongest young men,
strongest men are off to war.
Off at war, which leaves a vacuum of to be filled by, God knows who. Well, we know who.
Mm-hmm.
But that it's interesting that people don't know about this, and that school, that this thing happened in 1946, and the Fighting Bunch took up arms, and they took care of business. They cleaned house.
And they took their government back.
They ran on what was called the GI ticket, and so what they did, it was like all the different, the county clerk, the mayor,
the sheriff, the mayor,
and they ran on the GI ticket, and through force of arms, they won. So you would think that this would be something that was taught.
And they had to respond the way they did because the men in power, the bosses, and so the sheriff, they deputized 200 men because they knew they were going up against all these. And at first, the veterans didn't even really have arms.
Right.
A few of them had pistols and stuff because there's a lot of guys back in that area, they hunt and stuff, and they have rifles. But it wasn't an armed thing at first. But the powers that be at this time in Athens and McMinn County, they deputized men, and they brought deputies from surrounding counties because they all had their own bosses. And we're going to get into it. All leads to Boss Crump over in Memphis.
Yeah, which is interesting.
A lot of these deputies were former convicts and things like that.
Yeah.
So these guys were getting paid $50 a day, which in today's dollars is over $600 a day.
Yeah. And
so they had a paid armed force of 200 thugs that were ready to enforce their ballot stealing, basically.
Right. So the writer, when he started researching this, and he's just published this year, I think. It's this year.
I think it was very recent.
Very recent. So when he went back to research this story, of course, a lot of people are dead and gone, and so he's left with the survivors and the stories. But it's real interesting that when he delved into it, he found a lot of original. There was a Tennessee History Quarterly, which had there was a lot of research done, original interviews with original participants, and research done with an article that was rejected by them. But strangely enough, they still had all that information in an archive for him to go through. The men that were in this, after it happened, there was not a vow of silence, but they didn't talk about it because they did things that could wind them up in jail.
Yeah. But they took care of business. They had to do some extrajudicial things because they were tyrants, and they in the years leading up to this, even while they were still at war, there was a state senator around who was also trying to lead the fight.
Right.
He was trying to get help from the U.S. Attorney General. He was trying to get help from the governor, which of course he owed his position to Boss Crump in Memphis. And
he couldn't get any help.
The media, the Supreme Court of Tennessee wouldn't help him. And it turns out, the sheriff became the state senator, and then they were going to swap, and the new sheriff, he was going to be the state senator, and that guy was going to be the sheriff again, Paul Cantrell.
Right.
And so they had to go extrajudicial and take care of business because they were being, ruled by a dictatorship.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, Ray Hammer, an Athens hardware store owner, wrote the Attorney General at the time. The good people of this county are sacrificing for the cause of America's freedom, but have lost their freedom at home. Both parties have lost the freedom of the ballot box. A dictatorship has been set up. The county treasury is being raided at the expense of the taxpayers, and the good people of this county would like to sell their property and move away. Your department is our last line of defense. Please, for God's sake, come to the rescue of helpless people.
And there were affidavits filed after each election going into the late 30s and into the 40s from a state senator would get people, and they sent reams of evidence to the Attorney General. And even the night of this battle, somebody telegraphed the governor of Tennessee and the U.S. Attorney General, and they received no response.
Right.
Nothing. They asked for help.
It's kind of like the same thing that that's going on now, even though this is, well, we did start seeking help before through the courts, and we could not get anywhere with all not legislation being passed, but they were printing ballot. We're just going to print ballots, absentee ballot. They just started,
just not following the law, which was what these guys did in Athens.
So when questioned about why the Fighting Bunch, why they took up arms, one of them said, they realize they have taken a serious step, said Downs, but do not interpret their action as taking the law into their own hands. Rather, they say, just put the law back in the hands of the people. It was a dictatorship down here. The elections were a farce. Remind you of something? While they were away at war, they were warned not to run for office and to stay away from the polls when they came home. No matter what happened, the machine promised they would win. Another put it simply, we just got plain tired of being pushed around by a bunch of thugs. And when you think about what's going on with our election and the poll watchers and the poll observers and how they've been bullied.
And you look at how this story hasn't been told at all, going back to 46. It's, we didn't know about, me and Yvonne, like we said in other broadcasts, we've been history buffs our whole life, and we read stuff. We read it for fun. We love delving into this stuff. And we had not really heard of this before, this year. And the way media covers things, that hasn't changed. There was never a golden age of media and being nonpartisan. And
Walter Duranty was covering up genocide in
Ukraine.
Was that 1930s?
30s.
Everything I need to know about geopolitics I learned from Frank Capra. Part of the process of preparing for war was to educate the military about the differences between our system of government and that of a fascist dictatorships. As they began to learn more about the totalitarian methods of Japan and Germany, many of these young men began to pay more attention to the undemocratic methods of the Cantrell machine. And so Cantrell,
Paul Cantrell, we can start showing some of these guys. So, you think about bosses, party bosses, political machine bosses. Well, you really, this guy was a caricature.
Yeah.
Dukes of Hazzard, Boss Hog fame. He was a caricature of these guys. He was based on real life people. And so at the top of the chain in Tennessee was this guy right here, Boss Crump.
I wonder, tell us in the comments if any of you know who Boss Crump, if you've heard of him. I'm just curious. It might just be just a local thing here.
And these guys, this was all over the country. There were states had their bosses. And of course you got Huey Long in Louisiana, and you've got the Dailies up in Chicago.
Right.
But people don't know about, unless you're from this region, Boss Crump in Memphis he ran Tennessee for 3 decades. Yeah.
For 3 decades.
And there's a side bit on him that we could go into about the adoption agency that was here.
Oh yeah, that might be another scope.
That's like. Let
me just whet your appetite on that. There was a name, something Tan. TANN was her last name, and she ran an adoption agency. But this adoption, and they would prey on girls that were poor, or they were pregnant, and back then it was a really big deal to not be married.
But that was just one of his many little.
But that whole thing is about baby trafficking, sex trafficking, and that went on for 3 decades. She died. It was and because of Boss Crump, he looked the other way.
And so the boss of McMahon County was this guy, Paul Cantrell. He became sheriff, I think, in 36, reelected. 42, he ran for state senate.
Yeah, because I think they had term limits. Mm-hmm. So then he would just go to sheriff, and then he went to senator.
He went to state senator. His chief deputy became the sheriff, of course, with their vote, their ballot counting, their stealing. And so in 46, when the Battle of Athens happens, Cantrell here was going back to being sheriff, and the sheriff who used to be his chief deputy was going to be the state senator. Yeah. So they were going to swap places, shuffle around. Now, when Cantrell first got into the state senate, he passed a bill, the Ripper Bill.
Yeah, the Ripper Bill.
And this thing basically just reduced precincts throughout the county, so it made it harder for people in outlying areas to vote. It also made it easier for them to control the process.
Right. I don't know if you guys know that we've done that in America here in preparation for 2020. Is they reduced the number, and I didn't understand that. I didn't think much about it, and now after I've read this book, I'm like, oh, it makes perfect sense. It makes it harder for people outside of the city, which is mostly. And it's funny. It's the same Republican Democrat divide where.
But and we'll also see that a lot of this happened in Republican-controlled areas too. So this is another one of those truly bipartisan problems.
Well, it's one of the reasons the Republicans don't try to take care of voter fraud because then
it messes up what they did when they were.
How do you think people like Mitch McConnell, John McCain, You know,
And
all
honestly,
these people.
got to talk about Brian Kemp in Georgia.
Yeah,
you know,
Brian Kemp.
Was he the
Yeah,
legitimate
did he
elector?
actually beat Stacey Adams? I don't know.
Or Abrams, or is it
Stacey
Abrams?
Adams.
Adams. I'm no fan of hers, but
she might have won.
Just on a segue, real quick, you should YouTube Brian Kemp political ads from when he ran for governor in 2016. They're pretty cringe.
Yeah. So Walter White was a resident of Athens. He said, "At present, the people of McMinn County have no more rights than the people of occupied France."
Mm-hmm.
So that's somebody from Athens, Tennessee, saying that shortly after World War II.
Yeah.
166. Hold on. I have so many good notes in here. I can't. I'm not going to be.
This scope could be 3 hours easy.
I can't read them all. We won't make it that long. But Jim Buttram. Let me not go on that. The young GIs were undeterred. They connected with Ralph Dugan and Major Anderson, and slowly the opposition came together. This is interesting about how the Fighting Bunch decided to do what they were going to do. They didn't tell their wives. They didn't tell their parents. They were concerned about their personal safety. Phone communications were conducted in code. They met in secret, in barns, in offices, at people's houses, and never in the same place twice. And they did this. When you read the book, and you'll understand why they did this. It was absolutely necessary that they had to go to these extremes. How the Fighting Bunch decided to do it got to the point where decent citizens were not safe on the streets if they had said anything against the Cantrell organization. They had to be careful because they would come after you. You know, they held a grudge. But I found that interesting that they didn't tell. They just confided within each other, and I guess they were worried about their wives or.
Well, they knew they were taking on some serious things, and they were taking care of business.
Right. 182. And this is another. So what the Cantrell administration did is they controlled all of the important parts of
the government. They controlled the election commission, the county clerk.
The county clerk.
Certified.
Get this: the county clerk made more money in 1946 than the vice president of the United States of America.
They were doing, and the sheriff did really well, and the deputies did well. The deputies at that time were paid. They were paid with fees. They did not have a salary.
They were, and during the Cantrell days, they were incentivized with these fees. So you were like the number of arrests.
Right. And then while they were in jail, they also made money off the food kitchen.
Right.
And so they targeted, and they really, it amped up when these veterans were coming back from the war. They targeted these veterans when they were getting off the bus, basically. They were arresting them. They'd arrest them at the bars and stuff because they knew they had their
they just come home from the war. And if you read
their muster out pay, they knew they had a lot of money on them. And so they trump up charge. They beat them up and then charge them for resisting arrest and throw them in jail.
When you read the book and you read what they went through in the Guadalcanal and the different islands that they fought on, there was one island where they were abandoned for like 3 weeks.
Well, Guadalcanal, the Navy had to leave them because the Japanese Navy kind of ran them out.
So they
were on their own.
Whatever they came off that boat with, that they took, their ammunition and their gun and their backpack, and some of them lost their backpacks. They survived like for 3 weeks just off the island
until the U.S. Navy could get
and actually what they went through as far as the Japanese interaction with the Japanese and all that, it's really traumatic. So to come back and you're having a beer and they greet you as you get off the bus, that's some nerve. So they come back, see what's going on, they want to take care of business, but the greatest, here's a quote from the book, but the greatest barrier to victory was a fair election. Another newspaper, so this is another thing about when the election is coming up, asked the governor whether McMinn County deputies would be arrested for assaulting GI poll watchers, and the governor refused to answer. Think about the poll watchers and the observers and all the stories that you've heard in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona. The same thing you've heard everywhere is that they were bullied, that they were. Yeah. And Scott Adams talks about that. I think he was more outraged at at the bullying of these poll workers and than the actual fraud. One more from that time period. No. So, hold on.
Well, and remembering about how the media covers stuff or doesn't cover things. You go Wikipedia, take it for what it is. It's kind of lopsided, but in all my times, I'll go to Wikipedia and look at stuff and look, but going in knowing that it's kind of slanted at different ways. Sometimes you will find stuff that maybe they don't think is important enough to worry about, so they don't mess up the telling of the tale too bad. But when I go to Battle of Athens, Tennessee, on Wikipedia, you get this warning on the front of it, at the top of it. And I've never seen this one before, but I don't know if you can read it on your screen, but it says, this article has multiple issues. Please help improve it or discuss these issues on the talk page. The issues it has is the neutrality of the style of writing in this article is questioned. And this article may contain an excessive amount of intricate detail that may interest only a particular audience. I'm like, I've never seen a warning like that before.
So is it true?
So
that it only interests a particular audience.
But why do they put that up? Because there are so many arcane things on there that people are going for what they're interested in seeing.
Right.
Why would they put that little alert in there that just stuck out?
So back to the deputies that would confront these the military servicemen when they got back off the bus. Deputies earned money for every arrest they made. An arrest motivated by money rather than public safety was known as fee grabbing. And so with the election of President Roosevelt, a flurry of acronyms appeared to fight the depressions. You had the AAA, the NYA, the NRA, the CCC, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps. They opened a camp in Athens, putting hundreds to work planting trees and soil. So they were being paid by the federal government. The sheriff's department and deputies see that as
all they saw was income.
So they targeted those people for arrest. 68. The leadership of McMinn. The leadership of McMinn County had a license to print money, and no voter could do a thing about it. What was going on in McMinn Valley was in McMinn at that time was illegal gambling, unlicensed bars, and houses of prostitution. There were dice games, cards, games, slot machines, and so they used.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of moonshine who would look the other way.
And they just took their protection money from all of these places.
This is kind of so here's another thing. The people that were responsible for the elections and the ballot counting and who were working these elections, the ballot boxes were in the courthouse suite of the Democratic trustee. So red flag right there. One state patrolman was the officer of election. Another was an election judge. The second election judge was Oliver Nichols, who had killed Carl Voiles and Hub Johnson and was still one of Cantrell's deputies.
Yeah.
So he murdered a couple of people, and he's a deputy. Two of Birch Biggs' gunmen from Polk County were on hand. One of them, Bill Hedden, had killed his own father 5 months after the election. Hedden murdered his sister-in-law and a second woman in an advanced stage of pregnancy. So along with the 14-month-old boy, those were the kind of people that the McMinn County relied on to enforce their will in place in between their neighbors and the ballot box. I mean, it was so out of control. It's almost not believable. One of the guys, the Fighting Bunch said, Love said it felt more like Gestapo in Nazi Germany than free America. Think about that. The left and the deep state and they call the Trump supporters Nazis, and meanwhile they're the ones. And
that's another nothing new under the sun thing, because that reminds me of stories of being at the home front in the Confederacy during the Civil War. The men are often, and this happens over and over again throughout history, is these wars, the men are gone from their families and they're away fighting. And what's left, there's a vacuum. And there's still men that don't, for whatever reason, they don't go to war.
Right.
They stay and they traumatize and prey on the local populations that are left behind. And so, these wars over and over, nothing new under the sun. All the men are gone away, and so it makes the communities weaker.
John Prophet, an Athens department store owner, told Biddle, "We who call ourselves Americans have looked down on Hitler and his methods, but here in McMinn County, we have conditions which make Hitler look like an angel with a dirty face."
And these guys especially escalated during the war while all these men were gone.
Right.
These young men, and not all of them were 19, 20, 21. Some of them were already married when they went off to war. So a lot of households were missing their father, their young sons, and
brothers.
The strength, a lot of strength of the community was gone, supposedly fighting for the defense of everybody back at home.
Right. Cantrell has openly boasted that he has 8 years graduated from the political school of Birch Biggs, wrote Myers. Cantrell and Biggs planned to build a statewide machine that would overtake Boss Crump's. So you had, factions. You had Cantrell in East Tennessee, and you had Boss Crump in West Tennessee.
And you look at them, it's like they had a uniform. You get some shitty rims,
They're like
glasses.
I know.
I mean, look at Boss
what
Crump.
a dork.
And that's actually a better picture of him. I could have put up a worse picture of him.
Killed in the service of the country in Athens, Tennessee. 141. Law enforcement. Oh, the machine. So the machine, they call it the Cantrell machine. The machine controlled law enforcement. They controlled the courts. They controlled elections. If they could murder so there was an active duty serviceman that had come back. His name was Earl Ford. He was a Navy Seabee, and he was happy to be home after 16 months. And to make a long story short, it was Deputy Minus Wilburn.
Minus Wilburn.
He saw them as they when they came back as like easy prey.
He just saw money.
Yeah, and there was a conflict, and Deputy Minus William shot him. Basically, he murdered him. If you read the story, he murdered him, and he got away with it. And so what they called it and how they wrote about it was that he died in the service of his country. I'm like, no, he didn't. He got murdered when he got back to Athens. He survived the war and he came back to Athens, and then he was murdered. And so this person says if they could murder an active duty sailor. Oh yeah, he was an active duty sailor that had come home on a break.
I think he was murdered during the war. He was murdered during the war. He was on leave.
But he was here on leave.
But he was on leave.
So if they can murder an active duty sailor in the middle of World War II and get away with it, then they could kill anyone, and who was going to stop them? So just adding to this group of men that had just returned, they're watching this, they're seeing this. They knew about him. I don't know if they had served with him. 48. Have city council. Oh, that's another thing. I'll just read you this short blip that won't make sense. But Anderson ran for mayor in 1945 on a pledge to have city council meetings, which hadn't happened for 4 months, and to open them to the public. Okay, here we are in Shelby County in 2020.
Everything's shut
where
down.
We're not having open meetings. A group of us went down to our Shelby County Commission on November 23rd, and about 30 of us gave powerful stories on how COVID restrictions and lockdowns have affected us. It was a very powerful and persuasive meeting. So what did they do?
And I told Yvonne at the time, I said, you know what? They're not going to let you come back again. They're going to use COVID to restrict that to a Zoom meeting so that they don't have to listen to that. And you also said, which was very important, the county health department was there for their little stuff in the beginning of the meeting, and they all walked out before these people
they didn't hear
gave their testimony. So the county health department was not concerned at all about people talking about real effects on their day-to-day lives.
We were going to go back and we were going to double the number that we had. And so the Friday before that Monday, they went online. And of course, the city of Memphis, so we have two dual forms of government. So we got Shelby County and Memphis. And Memphis has been shut down as far as those meetings since March. It's just online. And of course, people have no control over what happened. You don't know if you can submit your concerns. There's no way of guaranteeing they will be heard. But I just thought that was interesting that that they hadn't had open meetings for 4 months. And so when he ran for mayor, he would open these things to the public, which should have already, you would think that would be a given, especially just after World War II here in America. So the more GIs they arrested, the more they beat up, the madder we got. So we've kind of got the same thing going. There's a cold anger, there's a rage boiling underneath with all the injustices that we see. And as they are not addressed by the DOJ, and it's continuing. Is it the right team? Oh, this is another good one. So Ralph Dugan thought it was like Nazi Germany, run by deputies who were nothing but a lot of swaggering, strutting stormtroopers, drunk most of the time, beating up our citizens for the slightest reasons. Bill Hamby, a captain in the South Pacific, said, if you were on the right team, why, you could get away with almost anything. If you were on the wrong team, you couldn't get away with anything. We have a protected class now, and we always have an unprotected
it's just
class.
Kind of we're able to see it more.
You look at the SWAT teams they sent to Roger Stone, Paul Manafort. Here we have stolen elections, and has that the video where is it Georgia or Pennsylvania? I forget where they sent the Republican poll workers home when they're counting the ballots tonight. We know that Ruby Freeman is the name of one of the person. Has she been? No, she's on the right team, and that's it goes back to nothing new under the sun. Tom stood up and he walked back into the polling place.
And just the day of the election, there were the deputies started seizing ballot boxes at a couple of different places. They actually shot a couple of people.
They did.
They shot a black farmer that was trying to vote. They said, "You're not voting here.
Yeah, did they kill him?
You're not voting." He didn't die. And they shot another veteran at another polling place. And so I think it was two or three different polling places where the deputies did seize ballot boxes. They came in, they stopped at like 4 PM. They stopped the voting and said, "This is over." They grab the ballot boxes and they take it to the courthouse, the central courthouse in Athens.
Right.
And so that's when these veterans they go and they seize a bunch of arms at the local National Guard armory. They get some 30-06s and they find pistols, and I think they get some they get dynamite from somewhere also.
Some other guy had access to the dynamite. But it was interesting because the Tom Gillespie.
But they could see with the other polling places where they didn't have as much control that the GI ticket was winning.
Right.
And winning big. So they, in several places, they stopped the voting. They grabbed, and people were out in the streets in Athens.
They stopped the voting. Same thing.
And they grabbed, but they overtly in front of everybody with some place in Athens, there were hundreds, maybe 2,000 people there that were starting to get antsy and like, what are you doing? And just stop. There are people in line voting, and they stop it. They grab boxes and they take them to the courthouse. Right. And they hole up with Paul Cantrell and a couple other people from the election commission, so that when they're in there, hold up with these ballot boxes, they have enough people on the election commission to go ahead and validate their election right there without viewers, without any,
They did the same exact things they're doing now. I've made one section of notes here for like 1946 or 2020. So listen to this. Congressman John Jennings had waged a fight for fair elections. He told newspapers that he had submitted to the Department of Justice sworn evidence of wholesale fraud, force, and theft in McMinn County. Deep in the shelves of the National Archives are big boxes filled with dusty manila folders, and inside are hundreds of pages of letters and affidavits from the people of McMinn describing terrors more fitting of our World War II adversaries than the United States.
This congressman was over the years, even during the war years, constantly seeing what was happening and trying to get help from the U.S. attorney, 2 different U.S. attorney generals, and getting no help. And I mean, people filed, sworn affidavits and reams of evidence and telling, these people are being unjustly, their elections are being stolen every 2 years, and these people they're being preyed upon. They're being, they're being arrested for nothing. People are getting murdered and nothing's happening.
Right. It's the same thing
was
as
a
now
tyranny. It
when
was
they
a
say
tyranny.
that there's no evidence. We've got affidavits,
Mhm.
out, galore. Okay, here's another one, 1946 or 2020. Absentee voting was another matter of dispute. State law permitted voters who would be gone from the county on election day to mail their ballot. Strict rules governed the process. The election commission was required to write down the name of everyone requesting a ballot in ink on a publicly posted list. All absentee ballots had to be received by registered mail. The envelope containing the ballot had to be preserved. The date it arrived had to be recorded next to the name of the requester. And a certificate for each vote had to be delivered to the official in charge of that voter's precinct. The election commission ignored every single one of these laws. That sounds just like the absentee voter mail-in that
And so that's why you got here, I'll put this one image up, you get the Battle of Athens. Because when these deputies end up holed up, I think it was about 50 or 60 of them in the courthouse, a large stone building. I think it's been torn down some years ago. But they surrounded this courthouse. And amazingly, other than the deputies, what they did, nobody died in this battle.
Right.
Some people were wounded, but these guys surrounded these veterans. They knew tactics. They had been in combat. None of these deputies ever had been in contact. All they had done was bullying and pushed around women and children mostly.
Yeah.
So these guys surrounded the courthouse, and then crowds.
That's an actual picture.
Anger swelled, and it's surprising that it didn't get more out of hand. But people, took it out on the deputies' cars.
Yeah, because their cars they had gotten all that was the spoils of their.
Yeah, they were
corruption.
able to buy stuff. They were buy nice houses, pay cash for houses, things like that.
Right.
They
actually lit some of these like all of the material things these people had gained over the years. It was destroyed. They destroyed it. Here's another 1946 or 2020. Okay, why steal or stuff the ballot box if you control the counts? This only made sense if the point was to demoralize voters, to break the rules in the most open and obvious ways and get away with it, to show them that they could never win. That's exactly what's going on. The voter fraud is so in your face.
Yeah.
And then when the Republican challengers, poll workers, or when they started putting up the cardboard over the windows and telling you people you had to go get this.
Well, and that's just, it's saying we can do this and you can't do anything about it. And it might end up being that that's the case.
Right. So how could this happen? Ballot boxes used instead of voting machines. Despite the law and a judge's order, the son of a candidate arrested by an officer working for the sheriff's brother, a ballot box taken home for lunch, 2 ballot boxes counted in secret in a building owned by the sheriff's family, ballot boxes recounted in the jail, officials who disenfranchised an entire precinct by deciding not to have an election, and voters told by armed men that they could not observe the count. How many times have ours been told that they can't observe? Why were 20 state troopers on hand, and why didn't they do anything? Why did the judge dismiss that serious allegations? Why did the state Supreme Court twice side with Paul Cantrell? The answer lay to the west on the banks of the Mississippi River. And that's where
he comes back into play.
Yeah.
Boss Crump. He ran the state of Tennessee from Memphis.
Athens, Tennessee is closer to Dayton, Ohio than it is to Memphis.
Because Tennessee's so long. Athens is kind of, I guess, in between Cleveland and Knoxville.
For those of you that don't know about Boss Crump, Edward Hull Crump lived in Memphis. He had grown up poor, the son of a Confederate cavalry captain who had died young. He sold peaches at train stations and did backbreaking work on farms and clawed his way to a low-level bookkeeping job in a small town. This led to a similar job with the Memphis Saddlery Company. 6 years later, he bought the saddlery and married into a prominent family. Crump won an upset race for city council, pledging to take on graft and corruption.
Oh, don't they all?
He was elected to the Board of Fire and Police Commissioners and demanded a midnight closing time for saloons. In a wildly popular stunt, he deputized 20 officers and took them on 3 raids to prove to the police and public that the law was enforceable. Crump ran for mayor on the same good government platform and won by 79 votes.
But when he got most powerful, he wasn't even mayor still. Other people were mayor.
Right.
And he basically, in the long run, appointed the governor. Basically, he would pick who was going to run, and then they would win.
Yeah, and then he would,
because this McMinn County was, I'll show you again. Boss Cantrell was one of Crump's men in McMinn County, and Trump had bosses all over the state in multiple counties. And
right.
They actually, these deputies on the Battle of Athens, a lot of these deputies were from surrounding counties. They had their own machines going as well.
Right. And this guy named Browning, who was running for something, forget what he was running for. He was running for, I don't know, something. He knew how Boss Crump worked, and he ordered the National Guard to Shelby County to monitor the election. But Crump filed a lawsuit, and a federal judge, Crump's cousin, ordered the U.S. Marshals to use force if necessary to keep the Guard out. And so, of course, Browning lost majorly. It looked like Trump, Biden. But they called this Gordon guy called him the Czar of Memphis shall not steal this election. But the Czar of Memphis did.
This goes back to my point earlier, is that they used guns back then to enforce this. But today, the enforcement mechanism is our consent out here in the public. We're just letting all these things happen.
Yeah, like the mask mandates and all this stuff. The only controlling legal authority that these governments have over you is your compliance. The minute
they don't even need to use guns anymore. They don't need to deputize convicts like they did in Athens. You just acquiesce, and they just get more powerful.
I already read you that one. East Tennessee they got a nickname called Little Shelby. Like Shelby County was like really corrupt. Everybody knew it, that was Boss Crump's area. And in East Athens was Little Shelby.
Cantrell here. He was definitely Crump's boy in East Tennessee. He was one of his main ones. And like I said earlier, when Cantrell introduced that Ripper bill in Tennessee in the state house and it passed, they started to use that in other counties too, because they were going to reduce polling places everywhere. Crump was just solidifying his grip on the state.
246. So as far as the battle that happened. So when they removed these ballot boxes,
they retreated to the courthouse with about 50, 60 deputies. They holed up in there. And
so these guys, the fighting bunch, they wanted the ballot box. They wanted the ballot boxes to be secured and the counting to continue, in an observed
the
manner.
GIs, they surround the building. They'd already gone to the National Guard Armory and secured weapons, and they got dynamite from somewhere else. And they fired a bunch of rounds into that, and it went on for several hours. And then they started getting word that the governor, earlier, some people telegraphed the governor and the U.S. Attorney General asking for help because of what was happening with them stealing the election. No answer. But then all of a sudden they started hearing the governor was trying to mobilize the National Guard to have them come in and put down these GIs.
Right.
So the GIs decided we got to take care of business right now we need to resolve this now. So they escalated with the dynamite, started sticking extra, very solid building. But they scared the crap out of those deputies because they had seen combat the GIs had, but the deputies hadn't.
And
they had no idea.
And these GIs were using what they had learned in wartime.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great read. I highly recommend that you read the book. Kathy says bullying causes compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, bullying causes compliance because people don't want.
They don't want to do conflict. They don't want to push back. They don't think it's too much but it gets worse down the line. The demands on you. As a matter of fact,
one of the guys, these guys never really talked about this to their fans. Some of them talked to a grandson or.
Yeah, they didn't really talk about
this one, Ken Mashburn's daughter, he had talked to her. He had said to her, do the right thing, even when it is not the easy thing. And I think that's where we are now with all this. It's not the easy thing, but it's the right thing. And if you don't do it, we're going to end up in another battle of Athens.
And it's going to be harder. It's going to be worse.
Right.
The longer you wait.
So when the GIs, had them under the gun, locked in that, and actually when they were in was it the bank or where they were holed up, or
they were in the courthouse.
Because they had three hostages. They had three.
They had
of the
two
GIs.
or three hostages. They also had the ballot boxes.
And they wouldn't let the hostages go because they knew that was their.
And Cantrell and the sheriff, they were running for each other's offices.
Yeah.
They were in there. They ended up getting the GIs, an ambulance pulled up at the courthouse. The GIs ceased fire. They figured they were getting wounded out. It was actually Boss Cantrell, and the sheriff also. They were just sneaking away and getting out. They left all those deputies behind.
Yeah, here's some of the things that witnesses said happened that night. The deputies were shouting, "Don't kill me! Please don't kill me!"
Yeah.
The deputies searched for weapons. Bill White led a group of GIs who marched the deputies down to the courthouse. So they spooked them out with the dynamite. Mm-hmm. They finally confessed, and they came out and they're like, "Please don't shoot." And so they surrendered.
Their hands raised as high as they could raise them.
Yeah, they're quaking in their boots. And so Bill White led a group of GIs who marched the deputies down to the courthouse, dragging and pushing them all the way and parading them around the square. Bill White was he's kind of like the main character. We're seeing this through his eyes.
He was kind of like he led the security group of the GIs.
Right.
And what I have up here is an image of all these deputies that they arrested the deputies and they put them in jail.
Right.
And none of these guys were ever in law enforcement again.
No, it's pretty awesome. Bill wanted them to get a look at the people they'd been oppressing, the ones they'd been sworn to protect. They marched the deputies back toward the jail. The deputies' fancy cars, mostly 1942 models, the last made for domestic use before the war, had been a constant visible reminder of their corruption. Now they were overturned, doused with gasoline oil, and set on fire. Anything that would break on the cars was broken, and anything that could be pulled off or cut or torn or just bashed to hell was just a fair target. The first car set upon was turned to smash junk in a matter of minutes.
The people were fed up, and they finally did something about it.
One of them, there were deputies who had been too scared to come outside, crawling on the floor. One wrapped his arms around a GI's leg, begging for help. There were gunshots inside the jail. The conquerors had not yet processed that it belonged to them now. I can imagine that would have been a stunning reversal of fortune for them, and that it wouldn't hit them right then. There were ballots all over the jail, stacks of ballots. I don't know if you guys have seen some of the ballots that have turned up in pallets, and there's just tons of them. I don't know if they've been filled out or not. I guess they were going to be used.
And that's what they were doing in the courthouse when they were holed up. They were trying to get the count in and certify it before they got taken.
Invoked Christmas Day is news. So there were ballots, stacks of ballots. All of these ballots were marked for Paul Cantrell. That makes you when you saw the ballot dumps for Biden, or the Dominion machines when there'd be 10,000 and 95% of them were for Biden.
Yeah,
it's the same thing. The ballot boxes were found opened in a cell with boxes of blanks.
They just had to
nearby.
Had to do it by hand back then.
And so as this is going on, there was a tremendous roar and a great cheer from the crowd as the GIs walked the ballot boxes toward the courthouse, where they would be placed under armed guard. "Down with Cantrell, down with the deputies," shouted someone. Someone started singing with the rest of the crowd, joined in. "God bless America, land that I love." I bet that was a really touching moment. 262, the rebirth. Richard Rogers, after this is all over and they're watching the aftermath of it, felt like he was witnessing a dramatic rebirth of the early days of the democracy. Something out of a movie. Man, it's
and these guys, when the Paul Cantrell ended up conceding and saying, "Yes, you guys won the election," because this GI ticket, they all won across the board, and it was overwhelming. And what they did was they deposed basically the current government and the councilmen and stuff, and of course they arrested all the deputies. They formed a commission. They kind of did like a Continental Congress of their own.
Yeah.
And they formed a government to take care of business
Because
until their elected officers took office.
The feds wanted to come in
and they said,
intervene,
yeah,
and they said, no,
we got this.
Yeah. And it's funny to me that the feds they thought better they knew better. I thought this was interesting. Paul Cantrell left. He didn't leave in an ambulance. It was a hearse. He left.
That's okay.
But not the way he might have suspected. He had managed to escape in the chaos and confusion that surrounded this liberation of the jail and appeared at the Quisenberry funeral home. Mark Quisenberry was not a supporter by any means, and certainly not keen on hosting the target of an angry mob, but Cantrell and Quisenberry were members of the Free and Accepted Masons, Blue Lodge chapter, and members of this brotherhood were bound by ancient rites to give succor to another. Quisenberry drove Paul Cantrell out of Athens in the back of his hearse. Cantrell made his way to his wife's hometown in North Carolina. I just thought that was interesting that due to, he's a Mason. He was a Mason. Yeah. And because of ancient, so the guy that drove the hearse was not a supporter of his, but because he was a Mason,
he had a commitment. He had a vow.
Brotherhood. Just a couple of things left. So the Tennessean praised what has happened in the beautiful little city of Athens in the McMinn County, which undoubtedly has awakened a thrill of pride throughout the machine-ridden state. Make no mistake, the McMinn County veterans and their supporters had first won their victory at the polls. Then they fought with their bare fists and such weapons as they could seize to protect their election from the theft attempted by the force of arms before their eyes. This was no riot, unless Bunker Hill was a riot. The Boston Tea Party of Tennessee, caused by a decade of election corruption and thievery, has stamped upon a brutal farce it had determined to endure no longer. The battle was what always has happened when men not born of a craven race have been pushed too far by tyranny.
And the question is, with all that's going on today, is there a too far for people to be pushed? Right.
And what you're watching now, God bless Ali and everybody doing the Stop the Steal and Eagle Ed Martin with Eagle Forum, and there's so many people involved with fighting this, and they're doing something that maybe if people in Athens had done before,
earlier, even before the war, when they started seeing this stuff, because then people make concessions and they just keep going.
Yeah.
Go, oh, well, I can deal with this.
Right. But our founding fathers wrote about it.
But they're going to escalate. It's going to escalate. The evil's going to constantly go, oh, I can go here too. I can do
until you stop it. And the side that we're fighting is evil. And if you doubt that, look at what they did to steal the election. The bullying, it's literally a replay of the Battle of Athens, but on a federal level where, there are people in powerful places that control the judiciary, the election commissions, important positions of power.
But it's just the overreach across the board. You're seeing so much compliance with all these COVID orders. There's all these orders and mandates. Nothing is law.
Right.
And people are just, people see a sign on a door and they go, oh, I got to do what the sign says.
And then we go in, we're not wearing a mask, and you might get a few bad looks, but nobody says anything. No. It's like, it's all perception. Yeah. So we're in this kind of in between where we don't have to go to the extreme of the Battle of Athens. We have, we can use civil disobedience.
Stop consenting.
Right.
That's it. And these guys took care of their community. They saw a problem.
They did. And that's another thing. If they hadn't gone off to war and seen such,
just horrors, depravity,
and what they did, and supposedly in, under the guise of fighting
of democracy and all that,
American freedom, that we're going to spread that to the rest of the world, and then come back to only see the fascism here. If they hadn't seen that, I don't know that they would have been able to do what they did. It's almost like to me, a God thing. People must be able to determine their fate at the ballot box in fair elections. Ultimately, Americans would not accept living under tyranny. The decisive action which has just occurred in our midst is a warning, and one which we cannot afford to overlook. So when in the aftermath, what you basically had was you had 28 elected officials. They resigned. Every deputy sheriff and police officer. So basically, your whole city's structure and leadership was gone and replaced by good men. I think that's pretty freaking amazing.
That's what you would call cleaning house. And so I guess we can start to wrap this up. And this is a great quote by Thomas Jefferson. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. And so right now it's kind of ass backwards.
Right.
And maybe not even, people don't even fear. They just, a lot of people just love the teat.
Right.
And love the comfort. So people got to decide. And the consent is the guns. Consent right now today is the guns that were used back then in Athens. And this is all over the country back, probably even now, but there were bosses in different states and different counties all over the country.
And when this you want to take that off? When this fighting bunch took on that group, what that did is that ended the corrupt machine in all of Tennessee. That ended Boss Crump.
That was the beginning of the end of this doofus right here.
Yeah, it ended. So it
was definitely the end for him.
Yeah,
Paul Cantrell, but
he
Boss
left,
Crump,
and I think and wound up in Georgia.
Georgia.
Yeah, everyone. Most of them fled.
So then they became this.
What's that sound?
Oh, it's just the freezer here.
Yeah, that's.
They became Boss Hog
with power. But it's up to us. We the people can resist. We can, show up in the streets, make phone calls. I was making phone calls yesterday. Ali had sent out a thing on Stop the Steal to call the Arizona officials because Arizona Republican Commission in Maricopa County is resisting the subpoenas for their machines. So what they're doing is they're filing a lawsuit in court to fight that. So I started calling a lot of the officials there, and I'm telling you, the ones that actually answered the phone, they were so grateful. One of them, Farnsworth, David Farnsworth.
Yeah.
Whoever answered the phone for him was telling me, he said, look, it is so good to hear from you. He said, look, keep doing what you're doing. We're going to win this. This ain't over. He was full of all kinds of good stuff. I remember Farnsworth is the guy that's fighting against sex trafficking.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other ballgame that somehow might tie into Jeff Flake and Mitt Romney.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know what? That gave me an idea. I think if I ever get a subpoena, I'm going to resist it.
Yeah. What can't we say?
Can we resist
use some of their excuses? I'm trying to think of what their excuses.
I think I'm going to resist it. I'm going to maybe just quote some of these guys.
Yeah.
See how that works out.
I'm going to file a lawsuit. I'm going to complain to a higher court. But we have the system of government already that our founding fathers fought for. So it's not a revolution. There's a lot I've been dealing with, and I don't know if they're trolls on my timeline that say, it's time to take up arms and finally do something about it. And I don't know if they're feds that are trying to incite something, but I'm like, no, we have the form of government. All we need to do is reclaim it.
Stop consenting to all this bullcrap.
And that's why people like Kemp and Arizona, and they're trying to keep the courts from
seeing all the stuff they did too.
Right, because we have that form of government that if we can just get past a certain point, and I don't know what that point is, but I feel like it's coming, and get one of these states to flip, that it's going to go in our way. Either way, I still feel like it's not over. But the Battle of Athens is one that it needs to be known the way that the American Revolution, the Civil War, it needs to be known. Because truthfully, that's what the Second Amendment is.
It's just another one of those stories that you find out about that. Why isn't this covered? Because we covered the media before about their biggest tool is lie by omission.
Right.
It's what they don't.
The dog that didn't bark.
What they don't report on, what they don't comment. They try to,
Just like the Wikipedia warning on the Battle of Athens.
That warning about I've never seen this when I've looked up stuff. And like I said, take Wikipedia for what it is. It's a lot of garbage, but I've never seen that warning before.
Right. It's
The neutrality of the style of writing this article is questioned.
Okay, it's questioned.
This article may contain an excessive amount of intricate detail that may interest only a particular audience. Doesn't that pertain to just about any Wikipedia article?
Right.
People look for what they're interested in, and then they read about it.
And I didn't need Wikipedia to tell me that.
Yeah.
So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, I hope you'll share it. Because right now we're in an existential battle for our survival, and I don't want it to get to the point of the Battle of Athens, and I don't think it's going to.
It doesn't need to. It's like I said. It's the consent. Our consent are their guns from back then.
Right.
They need the bosses, Boss Crump, Boss Cantrell. They needed guns and deputies with guns to enforce their
But all it took was
Now-
some ragtag bunch of young, military guys
demobilized vets. But
Right.
now all the bosses of this country need are a bunch of people that just consent to all this bullcrap.
right, and resist. The resist. We're the resistance.
Yeah.
What was # resistance? Not the left, but anyway, we'll be back in January after, hopefully, by which Trump will have been declared the winner.
I don't think it's going to happen until closer to the 20th. And
I don't know. I think next week's going to be I have a feeling that next week's going to be. And maybe it doesn't get finalized until then, but next week's going to be big. Wikipedia is controlled by lefties. Even Larry Sanger left it. Yeah, Larry Sanger was one of the creators of Wikipedia. This is true.
Well, we'll be back next month. Should be the 13th. We'll shoot for that. I don't even know what day that
I don't either, but
falls on.
we'll have the Ides sometime.
Sometime in January. And appreciate you guys joining, and we'll see you in about a month.
Bye.